Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about a very timely topic, and that is plastic pollution. My guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. Alice Ma is professor of sociology at the University of Warwick with research interests in environmental justice, corporate power, and the politics of green industrial transformations. She's the author of Plastic Unlimited: How Corporations Are Fueling the Ecological Crisis and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Alice Ma, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks for having me on the program. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today. Why don't we get right into your book? First off, what's the thrust of your book, and why did you decide to write it now?
I decided to write this book because I was interested in or worried by a puzzle about the global plastics crisis. So we've all seen the rising media attention, public awareness, campaigns, incredible activism in relation to plastic pollution over the past few years. And you would think that with all of this rising attention, the problem would be getting better, but actually it's getting worse, and it's predicted to get even more worse. The predictions for plastic growth, as well as plastics waste, which is associated with the growth, are going to continue to rise and rise with no real end in sight. And so I wanted to know, what's the problem here? And for years, I had been researching the global petrochemical industry, which is the main industry that makes plastics out of fossil fuels, and became very interested in how they responded to the plastics crisis as a kind of an existential threat to their industry, and responded very quickly to contain that threat in a way to the industry and to ensure that it didn't do damage. And this book is an exploration of the role of corporations, particularly plastics and petrochemical corporations, in basically exacerbating the ecological crisis through avoiding responsibility and placing the blame on consumers, and and framing the problem in terms of waste rather than in terms of production. And so I looked at a series of different crises that the industry has been under since the beginning of the plastics age, really. First, in relation to toxic scandals about how toxic plastics that were put onto the market were. Then in relation to plastic waste, which dates back for some time. And later in relation to the climate crisis, and more recently, the pandemic.
Exactly. When we think of plastic, as we look around, I guess we could look at things on our desks, and even, I guess, cosmetics, perfumes, eye makeup, things like that. There are so many uses for plastics today. Is there anything that maybe it'd be easier to say what plastics is not in as opposed to what it is in? How pervasive are plastics in our societies around the world?
Yeah, it's amazing to think how pervasive plastics are, and how not pervasive, how they were barely in existence, really, less than 100 years ago. So yeah, they have become embedded and in everything from computers, houses, hospitals, roads, cars, like basically every material today that's modern and manufactured. Almost all of them will have some kind of plastic as a composite material. So you might not necessarily see it as plastic, like a plastic bottle or something readily identifiable, but it will, it's in pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm. Why are plastics so devastating? Are there various classes of plastics? I think of things that we use, well, like you mentioned, water bottles, CPAP machines, a variety of electronic equipment. Computers have a lot of plastic items in them, things like that. I'm trying to think, well, even these Teflon skillets, are there different gradations of the dangers of the various types of plastics?
Yes, and I should emphasize that I'm not a toxicologist or
Right.
someone who knows
Understood.
there's many thousands of different kinds of plastic products. I mean, the major classes that are problematic from a consumer perspective would be the phthalates, which make things flexible, like in car seats, in medical tubing, in shower curtains. And that's because what's put into the plastics to make them flexible leaches out and can cause disruptions to hormone systems. Bisphenol A is also a carcinogenic plastic found in many materials, but both phthalates and bisphenol A or BPA are banned in particular kinds of applications like children's toys or in certain kinds of food contacts. Vinyl chloride or PVC, which is related, is also was the source of some of the earliest toxic scandals. There are a number of, and what you mentioned, Teflon, the forever chemicals, those are the most recent in a way that have come to light in terms of public health scandals. But I think it's important to realize actually that plastics are toxic at every stage of the life cycle, including at their production stage. So even if you might produce at the end like a chemically stable, say, I don't know, ethylene kind of polyethylene bottle or something that isn't toxic to touch as such, the production of it, the petrochemical plant will have produced a number of toxic emissions. So living close to those petrochemical facilities would involve toxic exposures of the workers and of the people who live close by. So it's actually, you can't really isolate, there's a toxic pick and there's a not toxic pick. It's all part of a combined process.
Now, you mentioned the petrochemical industry and their role in this. Are there, who are we talking about? Certain companies in this particular area, or certain companies that are some of the giants in promoting plastic products, or are they worldwide? There's so many of them out there that it's just difficult to identify them.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I don't, produce lists like some of the, activist organizations would, where it would be like the top 10 corporate polluters and gradations of whether they're a good or a bad kind of a company. I do differentiate between, the different types of players in terms of plastics. There's those that are more close to the fossil fuel kinds of companies, the petrochemical producers. So those would be like the giants, as you mentioned, like ExxonMobil, also state-owned major enterprises like Chinese Sinopec. And then you have multinational chemical companies like Dow or BASF. But I think one of the interesting issues is that until quite recently, actually, those who were named the top polluters of plastic pollution are actually the big brands who are have their brands on the plastic waste. So Coca-Cola or Nestle, because they produce all this, end product plastic packaging, and then it's on the beaches, and that's a very visible, tangible form of evidence of that plastic pollution. And there's all those sort of medium firms in the middle who convert the plastics. And so I think there are those that have bigger market share. There are those who have slightly different interests in terms of the whole game. But I think I argue that they have common interests. One is obviously in the product itself, like the continued societal dependence on plastics, which they have, over many decades manufactured that need, and sometimes overtly so for knowing that it's a harmful product. Sometimes not, though. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not saying that all people who work for these companies or all the companies even themselves are somehow malicious. It's part of a structure of the way corporations work. And it just, it happens to be the case that they are harmful or wasteful or using a lot of greenhouse gases in their production. And that means that they are although they can, maybe feel better about it being essential in some ways, like helping with medicine and really important aspects of modern life and technology, there is that other side of it that many of the corporations have worked to ignore, to deny, and to find ways of avoiding that responsibility.
Now, it may vary from country to country or continent to continent. I'm not sure how this works, but I know in the United States, we've heard a lot over the past several years about PFAS and how they're in our water supply, that so many of the water companies are still not cleaning the water sufficiently enough. First off, what are PFAS and how pervasive are they, and not only in North America, but maybe worldwide?
Well, those are polyfluorinated alkyl substances. I can't pronounce it all. But
I know it's about 14,
the wider
14 syllables long. Understood.
Yeah, and yeah, I think the reason why that has dominated news more recently is because it's actually quite astonishing that has actually only come to light in terms of public attention and a huge legal case very recently in the last few years, and they had covered up the fact that these they knew about the harms that they caused in terms of toxicity to ecosystems and to people. And I guess the most well-known brand is the Teflon nonstick cookware. It's also in firefighting foam. And I think a lot of the scandals had to do with leakage from factories as well, not just in North America, but also in Europe as the major legal cases. I don't know much beyond that in terms of like how. There's been regulations that have come through in terms of calling them a persistent pollutant that causes damage over persists in the environment and causes problematic, health issues and should be regulated against.
Right. Now, it seems like there's a pattern. And of course, I guess if anyone has an economic interest, be it the cigarette manufacturers, be it fossil fuel producers, be it plastic producers, we saw back decades ago about cigarettes and how the cigarette producers actually knew that smoking was harmful to your health. They knew what nicotine did. They knew how carcinogenic cigarettes and other types of smoking apparatuses were. We saw the fossil fuel industry. So many of those companies, they had studies going back to the 70s showing that there was a direct link between producing or burning fossil fuels and warming the climate and creating a climate change to a large degree. And so now we have the plastic industries. What can be done, or maybe what is being done, what should be done, and what can be done to try to get them to control these very toxic substances and to maybe come up with alternatives, or to at least reduce the risk of being infected or developing some type of disease.
Yeah, I should point out that the plastics industry has the same notorious record as the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, and obviously it's part of the fossil fuel industry in some ways. And the vinyl chloride scandals dating from the 1960s were precisely the same dynamic, where they knew and did research to find out that vinyl chloride was causing cancer and a rare degenerative bone disease among their workers. And they conspired to hide that from regulators and from the public. And it was only revealed, the cover-up was only revealed many years later. There are similar allegations coming out now about how they created recycling programs in order to continue to be able to have the license to produce plastics without having the guilt. So sort of encouraging the disposable culture. So what can you do? I mean, I think what my research shows, and it was kind of an experience where I wanted them to be better in a way. I wanted to have faith in, I guess, for it not to be such a picture. But every document I looked at, every interview, the further I looked, the more you could see that pattern. And I think right now, I mean, it is promising that there's more and more pressure for them to change, but there's no binding legal mechanisms to hold them responsible for those issues. And in relation to toxicity in particular, they use the classic kind of move in terms of denying epidemiological evidence, saying, yeah, like with the tobacco industry, we don't know, it's very uncertain, you can't tell. But the problem with that is that the levels of demonstrable scientific evidence are so high that people are going to be really, ill or dying before it's actually kind of demonstrable. And there's ways of, being quite slippery about that. So I think it's interesting that they're actually quite proactive right now on climate and plastics waste, through framing it, through thinking about the solutions. But toxicity, they never talk about unless they're under like a legal case, because otherwise it opens that door to liability.
Right. And of course, it's probably up to the individual countries, their parliaments, their legislatures, their leadership, the executive leadership, and how strong their environmental agencies are as to what they're going to do. And of course, the UN has a role to play in this, and we'll get into that in just a moment. Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer and you like our shows, you would like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at one of those international issues, and that's plastic pollution, and that probably affects everybody on the planet, even folks, indigenous people who live at the headwaters of the Amazon River, which is a guess on my part. But my guest today is an expert on this topic. Dr. Alice Ma is a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick. She recently authored a book titled Plastic Unlimited: How Corporations Are Fueling the Ecological Crisis and What We Can Do About It. Dr. Ma, we're talking about plastics. You mentioned a minute ago recycling. What do recycling efforts work? I know a lot of people recycle. I recycle. There's a movement, certainly, I guess, worldwide, for us to recycle our glass, our plastics, our papers, those types of things. But does recycling plastic actually work?
Well, you may be aware of the statistic, the very well, kind of almost meme-like statistic that came out a couple of years ago, that only 9% of plastic that's ever been produced has been recycled. So there are very low rates of recycling. So that's one problem. I mean, we can hope to improve. So there are questions about how we improve that. Recycling also uses energy, which many people don't realize. So it's not a perfectly closed system where you can just convert something back magically into something new. And it tends to degrade also a material. So it's not converting it back into exactly the same form as before. The other problem is that it encourages a disposable culture. So the example I like to, or just still can't get my head around, is 500 billion plastic bottles produced every year now, steadily on the rise since basically none in the 1970s. And if you think of that as a sort of 9% of those recycled, and then those are still recycled or still being produced and rising, then you just think about those volumes. And so that kind of disposable, culture that kind of assumption that if you just put it in the bin, then it will be okay is part of the problem. I mean, the other one is about contaminated recycling, which the US has probably experienced quite a lot. When China banned the plastic the import of plastic waste into its country back in 2018, it basically put a huge spanner into the global recycling networks who were exporting, like legally trading, but they're very, very low value and kind of mixed and so on, and plastic recyclables to China. And then after a certain point, with many kind of warning signs saying this is really not nice stuff, and we're having to incinerate it, it's all kinds of toxic issues in China, then they just finally sort of said, no, we're not going to take that anymore. And now it's been going to other countries, and that trade is very unjust because many countries accept the shipments, then can't manage them through their infrastructures. And so there is a big problem that recycling systems themselves have become dependent in kind of many, I guess you could say, rich countries on exporting it and assuming that it was fine and that other countries would want it because it's cheap. But now that that is changing and there's just too much of it. And so countries are not able to cope with their own waste and their own recycled materials. And those recycling systems are, in many cases, not particularly efficient.
Exactly. And of course, many of us, I'm sure we've seen pictures of these garbage scows, really barges just loaded 10, 15, 20 meters high with all these plastic refuse from computers and a variety of other things, trying to find a home in some poor country, really, you come right down to it, looking to go into an economically developing country to unload this stuff. But before we run out of time, I wanted to mention that it's been a couple of months ago, the United Nations Environment Program had a major conference in Nairobi, Kenya. And at this conference, they developed, I think it's one of the first international agreements to try to get a handle on some of this plastic pollution. How does this agreement tie into this? Now, of course, this all depends upon the goodwill of the individual countries, because they're the ones who have to make it work. But how important is this agreement, that we at least have some kind of an umbrella to bring folks together to focus on these problems? And we think about just the hundreds of tons of plastics floating, the gyres floating out in the oceans where the currents come together, and you got these floating islands of plastic. But there are all types of examples of how we need to get a handle on. But how important is this international conference? Or agreement, I should say.
It's extremely important. I mean, it's been called, and was called in the work up to it, the Paris Agreement for plastics. And so there was no global treaty of that level for plastic. There were sort of different types of treaties on oceans and pollution and so on, but they weren't joined up. And people or countries, as well as many businesses, are actually crying out for a kind of a uniform set of legislation, regulation, because it's so disjointed and nothing's working. So there's a lot of really promising ideas and policies to be worked out, but it's kind of like the very beginning, right, of those 26 climate change conferences, where they haven't even reached an agreement yet. They've just decided that they're going to do so over the next couple of years. And so there are a lot of battlegrounds, I guess, to fight over. And one of them is over the production issue. So many of the states, as well as the sort of lobbying interests, would want to keep the focus entirely focused on waste, on the issue of leakage, and treating that at end source and not touching growth.
Exactly. That's one of the few fora in the world where all the countries of the world can come together under the United Nations to focus on this problem. As you mentioned, there are no easy answers. There's not an easy solution, and we need to work together on this. But Dr. Alice Ma, I want to thank you so very much, first of all, for writing your very interesting book on Plastic Unlimited, how corporations are fueling the ecological crisis and what we can do about it. And secondly, I want to thank you for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.